Again, this is the Opportunity Zones Meetup. As far as I can tell, it's still the only meetup in the United States on this topic, so I still anticipate we may see more. If we obtain some sponsorship for this program, one of our options is to expand the program into other cities under our common banner and recruit some people in other towns who may be interested in putting on the same or similar programs in their local communities. So for this particular meetup, which I put together, I have three primary goals. One is info sharing, such as talking about who's doing what, where programs are at, what projects might be in motion, sources of opportunity zone funding or funds that are coming together. What we've found is what most people would like to see are actually hardcore examples, something that's in existence, and there's almost no projects, less than 10 that I know of, that have been completed. I'm certain the number is far higher than that, but we're not finding any central depository of information that's doing that. We know that in I think it's Bangor, Maine, they redeveloped a city on Main Street, a building on Main Street as a historical building that was a project that was already in motion, and the Opportunity Zone just made it easier to raise the funding. We know of a large multi-unit, multi-family, I believe in Las Vegas, that another group has put together. There is a group here in Colorado who funded a housing project on the western slope, but I haven't been able to get details on it yet. But it's been that kind of anecdotal, very slim information kind of a situation. And so what we've been doing is talking to projects that I know about personally or I may be involved with, and doing an outreach to anyone we find anywhere and asking if they would share their information or their project and bring it forward. So if one of you happen to have a project that you have in mind, we'd be happy to make it the subject of one of these meetups through the end of the year. Then along the way, we're always getting questions. Does this happen? Can you do that? And some of them have been very interesting, strange, and challenging questions. And for some of them, we've come up with some answers. Some of them, we're still working on it. Some of them may require that we wait until the IRS issue the rest of the proposed regulations, or we get some opinions from the IRS that will help explain how this will work. And the answers so far have been, I call, reasonable. This whole program is relatively loose. Too many economic development programs have too many hoops, or you have to jump too high before you can qualify or participate, or they're actually counterproductive from a private standpoint. And this one is pretty flex. You can do all kinds of different things within this program without going out of bounds. And so I continue to be very optimistic that this is going to have a lot of impact over time once everybody figures it out and can do kind of a compare and contrast between doing it the other way or the old-fashioned way and doing it this way. So tonight we're going to be talking about the Colorado Indoor Ag Cooperative as a case study. And we're going to get into as much detail as exists today. Component parts of this project are kind of unfolding right now or in motion, but nothing so far that you would call a coherent story. So in Colorado, we've had a number of studies done that show that we import about 95% of all the fresh produce that we consume in the state. This is the produce that you have in a salad at a restaurant, anything you would buy at a grocery store, something you would pick up at a retail outlet, or something else along the way. And I, like everybody else, should turn off my phone before I start speaking. This poses a number of challenges, and we're seeing a lot of communities becoming food deserts. Now, the definition of a food desert is a grocery store that's not within easy, convenient walking or driving distance. So in some cases, it's defined as a zone that's no more than a mile in area. There are a lot of rural communities that are becoming food deserts where there's no access to local fresh produce because the stores are much further away. We also, a point is made, because you'll see articles like in the Denver Post over the weekend, $100,000 is spent by the state to support community gardens. And they were talking about how this is going to help jobs and local food production and so forth. The fact of the matter is we only have 5 growing months out of this 12 in which you can grow anything in any quantity. And so there's no way that you're going to supply the fresh produce needed by a family throughout a year with any of the programs that are CSAs or other things that are out there in the community. You pretty much have to go indoors with controlled growing environments, or you can't get to where you want to go. Local food production has been studied. There are all kinds of programs and policies and things, mostly coming out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, with a variety of foundations and other groups studying this. And you see more jobs, better economy, better food security, mitigating climate change, and then just better, tastier, and more nutritious foods. These are a lot of good reasons which span everyone who eats, so no one's been left out of the potential benefit of a project of this scale, and we're going to try to figure out how to do that. So right now, the general concept is we would create a food cooperative in a legal structure. It would work with 6 regional food processing hubs, and in turn those would work with 65 plus individual community greenhouse businesses. So all in all, there's over 70 different potential operations taking place. As we envision it, these will all be independent entities working in concert with each other rather than a single megaplex. And part of that is because we don't believe that you can get the funding together for something of this size and scale. So we've based upon analysis of doing a lot of work with local greenhouse projects, greenhouse manufacturers of buildings, equipment, and looking at the supply chains and distances across Colorado. We put a very rough estimate that this project will cost about $400 million. And in order to put all these things up and into operation. So in looking at opportunity zone investments, classically what you have is an investor. They are required to put cash into a fund. They're not allowed to roll in any other form of capital, so they cannot make a contribution of land or equipment or anything else. The fund then may directly invest into a business or a property, and at that point the fund may become largely inactive other than as a federal reporting entity for the period of time of the investment, or in some cases the fund is the operating entity because there is no underlying legal entity to work with. And so if the fund were to acquire and develop property, the fund is taking on the role of a property developer at that point. For a variety of reasons, most people are recommending that the money come from the fund into a business because you have greater flexibility in how the money is spent, greater flexibility in where it is spent, and a longer period of time over which to do that. So most people are recommending that the fund put the money into a business, but at that point in time, the business has to have a clear statement of how the use of proceeds are going to be expended, even if that's going to take place over a period of years. So at that point in time, so if you make an investment into a fund and then it puts it into the business or property, then there are 3 primary benefits that come out, 4 primary benefits that come out of this. The capital gain that's incurred over here, which would subject you to taxes, is deferred. And as long as you leave it in the investment, that deferral continues. Now right now they placed a dead stop of 2026 as the last date, but at that point in time you then become liable for these capital gains taxes. But if the investment has been 5 years, you get a reduction of that tax, and if it's 7 years, you get another reduction, which reduces your total tax liability by 15%. The big home run in opportunity zones is that if you put money into an investment for 10 years, the gain on that investment becomes tax-free. And this is what most people are concerned about. Now, you can continue to make investments throughout this entire time period. You have until 2046 to cap the project and do your distributions out of it and realize all this tax-free gain at that time. So we're still trying to figure out on a project-by-project basis what is the best construction of the project to minimize taxes over a period of time. And there is not a single solution. Everything is going to have to be on a case-by-case basis. We're looking at mega projects where they want to put the money into a property, not touch it for 10 years, and then sell the property off at an appreciated value. There is a single transaction of money going in and a single transaction of money going out. Most projects I'm looking at right now, the money's going into a business. The business during the course of a 10-year time period is going to be realizing ordinary income from its activities, and that ordinary income will be taxed in the usual fashion, but the equity in the company is carried over that 10-year time period, and so then there needs to be some kind of event at the end of the 10 years to take the investors or the fund, which is the representative of the investors, out of the deal and cash them out so that they can go forward. And that is the point upon which the tax-free status applies. So in the more complex, more intensive transactions, we're trying to figure out how to mitigate the ordinary income so there's more cash building up, more aggregating. At the same time, we want that money to be active and working, not sitting idle during this time frame once it's there, so that this is continuing to build value over the time period, all of which will have a greater impact on the community in which the project is based. So in this case, we'll talk about how this may apply to what we're talking about doing. So one of the questions, or one of the models we could use for doing a $400 million project is, what if we just did an opportunity zone capital raise for $400 million and we got enough money raised in that fashion to write a check for everything? That is a theoretical possibility, but not necessarily practical. There are very few people who have $400 million, and for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into later in the program, we're going to talk about why it's unlikely that we're going to see anybody write a check of this size as a single source of capital for this particular project, regardless of whether or not they're getting opportunity zone benefits or not. So as we look at this, in any of these models for how to fund this project, we're going to ask four primary questions. Who are the investors? Why do they care? What's their capability of making an investment? What kind of deal structure would we offer them that would be attractive enough for them to put up the money necessary to put money into the project? What kind of a capital campaign is necessary to raise that particular money? And then we're going to talk about the challenges that are there. So in this case, our biggest problem is there just aren't going to be a lot of candidates who are going to be large enough to put this kind of money into motion. In all likelihood, this would be a very simple, straightforward equity deal, and there wouldn't be much else going on. The capital raise is probably going to be almost like a private campaign where somebody knows somebody, they're going to go talk to them about doing the deal. So if Charles Branson decided that this was the next big thing for his industries to get into, somebody might talk to him, he agrees to write a check, he figures out how to take most advantage of the opportunity zone funding and goes from there. Challenge-wise, this may not be where he wants to go, but there have been a number of people who have stepped into what I call the big food space, which is what this represents by volume, where they're getting into meatless foods, they're getting into some of the fish things. DiCaprio made a major investment in a couple projects last year, and so it is possible that maybe somehow, some way this story could unfold, but it's not considered a high probability scenario. The next thing we look at are capital stacks, and under an optimum thing, we would try to raise only part of the money we need, 20%, in an equity raise through an opportunity zone investment, and then try to fund the back end with a loan of some kind. Again, if this is a single entity and we're talking about funding $82 million in equity, that's still too large of a size that we would necessarily find the money we're looking for, but it now becomes more possible. There are large foundations who might look at this as a program-related investment tied to food or health or just rural communities. Here in Colorado, we have several that wear this mission and might see putting up the front-end money to be then back-ended with a USDA guaranteed loan. And so we can now start putting names and labels on this as potential sources of capital. But again, at this size and scale, not very many candidates will fill this out. Deal structure, again, now with the mezzanine, we're going to be looking at doing debt plus equity. The equity will be a straight participation in profits over a period of time. Typically, you're going to tie that up in a corporate structure so that you will get a lower tax over time. But you have to, again, run the numbers on what the ordinary income is versus that comes out of that versus what might happen if it's taxed at the corporate rate. So LLC or C Corp, not certain on that. Capital raise will probably, again, because size and scale, be a private, small-scale group of people who would come together and might make that happen. You're still too large to do even a Regulation A size crowdfunding campaign, but you could do a completely private 506c crowdfunding to try to pull all that together. Lots of challenges that are there, and again, we'll get into those in more detail. We also looked on this on whether or not we could raise the money where we break the entire project into 3 tiers. The first one would be the sales, which would be the co-op entity itself, and then the food hubs would all be a single entity, and all the community greenhouses would be yet another entity. By breaking it apart, we can do more specialization in the operations, but it also breaks the money down into lower dollar amounts, which makes this more fundable. I don't think we're going to, we're not going to be at optimum yet, but we're moving in the right direction, because every time we break it into component parts, we're expanding the scope of the number of potential investors. We may be able to start doing specialty things on deals in order to get the money in. So I might be able to go to a community and say, I'd like to put a food hub in your backyard. What can you do for me from a city economic development standpoint to either give me tax incentives or other types of things, not at the Amazon scale, but nonetheless different incentives to come into their backyard and help out. Capital raise could be broken down now to a size and scale where you're using either a private syndication for angel investors. You could be looking at combinations of other types of capital, and you could even do crowdfunding to a certain degree. The one that I'm recommending on this is what we call a tiered and distributed approach. And what this would amount to is raising money for the co-op, for each of the individual food processing hubs, and for each of the individual community greenhouse businesses. And the reason why I like this is I don't have to raise all the money to start. We may be able to start the thing with a single co-op, a single food hub, and maybe 10 community greenhouses, so we have a way to break or stage the assembly of this. Plus, we can now be reaching into different pockets for different sources of funding. At the community level, we could do a small crowdfunding campaign and beat the drum about the fact that they're going to get local jobs and local fresh food. And so the communities might be doing matching money with Oz money in order for us to put these together, and getting enough communities to start the system may give us enough traction to kick this thing forward. Now, as is proposed, this would be over 70 different capital campaigns. that would be running, and you would assume that a lot of these would be running concurrently, which is both a negative from a complexity standpoint, but it's also positive because you can be leveraging the press and the buzz in the community to get a greater reach on that. Under the modeled and tiered distributed, as we looked at it, we have a lot of opportunity zones across Colorado. These are all shown in yellow here, and there are enough locations that we could probably put a community greenhouse business in each of the 65 Colorado counties. Now, not all the counties have an opportunity zone, so in those we would have to work under the limitation that if we're going the money directly out of a fund, 90% of the money has to be in an opportunity zone and 10% out. If we're doing this within a business funded by an opportunity zone, you can go as much as 30% outside of a zone and 70% inside of a zone. So you start doing more balancing between that. And again, this gives us more flexibility. But obviously, if we were going to build a hub and the co-op and a greenhouse in a single location, the rest of the state could care less. It's not dissimilar from my interest in the wild card football games going on this weekend because the Broncos weren't playing. So as much as there were some really good games, I just wasn't excited about them. And similarly, if we're doing something where we're raising money and it's only benefiting a single municipality or a single county, the rest of the counties wouldn't participate, wouldn't have the interest in it that they would have if we could place a greenhouse business in this corner of the county, and it has a huge impact because it may create 15, 20 above average income jobs in that community. That's a big deal. This tiered and distributed matches up well with distributing the potential of opportunity zones across the entire state, and collectively would cause more people to benefit from this entire project rather than having it isolated in a single area. The deals can change a lot. Once we get to the point where we've distributed the greenhouses over large sections of the state of Colorado, we can start looking at and create incentives that are coupled with the investment. So if you invested in a community greenhouse in Olney Springs, Colorado, we may set it up so that you get a discount on the food that is produced in that greenhouse or food coming out of the system as a perk for making an investment into the local greenhouse. By creating these monetary extended benefits or non-monetary benefits, we have a greater compelling story for people to do investment across the state by spreading it out in that fashion. The capital raises, for the most part, are probably going to take the form of crowdfunding within the greenhouse areas. At the food hubs, we may see something that's more targeted and working towards a different class or group of investors than we would see at the local level. So one of the other things that keeps coming up in discussions about opportunity zones and is pertinent to working on a local food production system is that if we build a greenhouse, there may be no place for the workers who are working in that greenhouse to live. A lot of these communities, all communities, are suffering a housing issue right now, and so there are other projects out there that are trying to address the housing issue. And although we're talking about creating a significant amount of jobs, anywhere from 1,200 direct jobs to 3,000 indirect jobs through this particular project, if there's no housing, it's going to be one of the things that holds us back. At the same time, we're talking about pushing the envelope on indoor ag and controlled environments, and that's going to raise the question where the skilled worker is going to come from. So it may be necessary to team with a community college or some other job training program in order to assure that we are training people for the jobs for each of these facilities as we go along. The other thing we're seeing, and particularly again in the rural communities, is that adding a business of this scale may overwhelm or go over the limit of an existing wastewater power system, or it may not have internet access in that particular community. So again, we may, if we're going to do a project in a community with a distributed system, it may need to be part of a larger plan that may look more like a public-private partnership in its structure at the local level, so that we can deal with all these other issues, which are other challenges in the communities that we're trying to help out. As I described, the distributed system gives us the broadest spectrum of potential investors, ranging from the very wealthy, including community foundations, and a variety of government programs and projects may qualify, in addition to classical angel investors and then non-accredited crowdfunding investors. The deal can get flexible because we have more range of options, more benefits that are generated by stakeholders at that level. And then the capital raise is just, it's going to be a matter of getting the word out, having the proper package, and promoting that to the potential investors. If we have 70 groups raising money at the same time, it will be almost a saturation level of media and promotion taking place, which means that you're going to get some benefit from the large volume again. Whereas if this were a singular monolithic project in a single community, there might only be one newspaper that's covering the whole thing, other than those who are looking at the global impact on the state of Colorado. So on investor candidates, we went through all the different people who would benefit from the success of this type of a project. This chart is in your handout in the back on Schedule A. And we talked about these all being prospective investor candidates at some level because of their potential to participate. And as you go around the circle, we have service providers who would be working for the co-op or any of the entities at the food processing and greenhouse level. We have the vendors who would be selling component parts into that, because if you're going to spend $400 million, the bulk of that is in land and buildings and equipment. And so all those are potential candidates to invest in this, where if they position themselves correctly, they may become the sole supplier or exclusive supplier for all these things that are going to be purchased. When we get into future agronomists, that's a reference to people who may have a new job that would come out of this, and as we're talking about 1,200 to 3,000 direct and indirect jobs from the success of this. But the key candidate that we're putting at the top of the list are the primary buyers of fresh produce. Right now, 95% is imported into the state. A lot of times when it arrives, it has a very short shelf life because it's been in transport since it's been harvested. This increases the amount of waste. A lot of grocery stores and restaurants are looking, well, grocery stores, and particularly 30 to 35% of the produce is wasted because of the fact that it has basically, it's a shelf life that is not very long, where if it's a fresh harvest, a head of lettuce may last 2 weeks. Fresh harvested, where it may only last a few days the other way. So we think that these being the primary customers through a direct sale, they're the ones who stand to gain most in terms of higher quality food, less waste, more nutritious, and so forth. And so there's in Colorado 1,800 food and beverage establishments in the state, and they would be a key target for raising funding for this particular project. Then we decided that the communities, which would see this as an economic development, would probably be the second part. So there we're looking at economic development, churches, chambers of commerce, health programs in the communities. All these have a reason to support this because it's good for them and their members, and it's part of improving the richness of life in that particular community. So we would expect them to be high up on the list. There's a fair number of people who would get jobs out of this. We don't expect them to be major investors, but they would be a channel for telling the story about this project during the course of a capital campaign. So if everyone who thought they would get a job would go out and tell all their friends and neighbors and associates and so forth, you have a better chance of getting the word out to the entire state so everybody knows about it. And at the state level, this would make a major improvement in the state of Colorado. It's an unarguable position that if we were to improve the quality of food, we have greater health, we have less issues elsewhere, we may or may not see a net increase or decrease in the price of food, but other than that, everything else would be good. And then we have, as I mentioned, lots of vendors and other people who would benefit from this, and they're all candidates to help with the campaign in some manner. So any investment campaign is going to start looking at this, trying to figure out who can write a check best. If we're combining opportunity zone funding with local money or government programs and other types of things, then we would come up with a capital stack that would be far more complex, but again, a higher probability of success. The deals we're looking at, obviously opportunity zone investments is an equity investment. They're not allowed to make loans out of the funds, so the money that's coming into a business, such as the ones we're talking about, would be equity, but that may be paired with loans from different places. Mentioned in there, we've got USDA loans, also SBA loans. In some cases, you would qualify for economic development loans to the Department of Commerce. You will have specialty programs like COPACE that allows you to build buildings at above standard environmental standards and borrow money from third parties and pay this back through property taxes. 22 of the counties in Colorado are currently participating in this program right now. We can get into the incentives, which is if you invest as a vendor, you may be designated as sole supplier. If you invest in this within a community where one of the greenhouses go, you may be able to get a discount on the food that's sold through that particular greenhouse. So we see almost a full range of possible deals, and then we get into the potential for different communities to do industrial bonds, revenue bonds, other types of financing at a community level. Beyond that we would see in a more of a classical private enterprise, something that's more pertinent to a public-private partnership. The capital raise is kind of an open question now. Where clearly it would be helpful to get up to about $500,000 in seed funding, probably equity, probably private, may or may not be Oz funding. That would help put together all the models, recruit the communities to participate, do the engineering and get the cost nailed down, and create the momentum and actually start the different individual capital campaigns. Then we could see three levels or types of raises, one for the co-op, one each for the hubs, and one each for the greenhouses. Those could be started before, during, or after any of the other raises because they could stand on their own 2 feet. They are an independent economic entity, but we'd like to see interlocking ownership so that all the hubs and greenhouses own a part of the co-op, and the co-op owns part of each of the hubs and greenhouses. So this is a tight system. And then we look at all the different supplemental forms of capital, and it would take days to go through all those things and why they may or may not work in this situation. So the challenges that I see right now is that we're looking at what I would otherwise call a mega project. It's $400 million plus. It involves a whole lot of things that are out there. From a dollar amount, there just aren't that many sources of money for a project of this size and scale, which is why I'm recommending breaking it down into bite-sized chunks, fundable chunks, going down that well. Growing food is not considered a high-margin type of a business. We're hopeful that we can get to a 10% ROI on this particular project, but at 10%, you're competing unfavorably with any high-tech gazelle that can do 15, 20 or better percent. And in the angel markets, we may not find that they are finding this whole deal attractive. The deal is high risk from any way you look at it, the size, complexity, the margins, all the different things combined together make this a high-risk project. And we're not going to be able to match the high risk with a high rate of return. So that'll work against us. Complexity is huge. It's bad enough that we're talking about 70 independent entities working in concert within a co-op, which is far smaller than AgFinity's doing with rural Colorado and regular agriculture, but nonetheless it's huge. And then they're turning around selling to 1,800 plus different potential customers, and doing that against established competition. So there's a handful of companies that are primary suppliers, wholesale food distributors, and it's really clear every dollar that is sold through this system is going to be pulling a dollar out of their pocket. So they're not going to go away. They're still going to fight for their turf, and it'll be interesting to see with this new type of competition, where was the market fall out. My suspicion would be that they would continue to serve larger organizations like the public school systems, where the purchase systems still need to change in order to accommodate what we're talking about, because they're based solely on price and don't allow for waste as a factor in doing a net cost of food over time. How long it's going to take to do this? Uncertain. If we had the money today, we could have all these greenhouses built up and operating within less than a year. The buildings themselves, the technology that goes into them, this has all been done many times. Getting it all to work together as a common system will take a little more work. And then setting up all the lines of distribution, because if you have 65 plus greenhouses using 3 to 6 common food processing hubs, which one are they going to go to? Which one's doing the processing? Which one's related to the different restaurants? And are you overlapping or shifting or doing other things? And I'm sure there's some people with chaos theory who would enjoy this as a project at that point. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these places are going to need better, improved infrastructure. You simply can't do it today with what's available. So all these challenges are huge, and the only reason we would be talking about this project is because the benefits are far greater than these challenges. So that brings me to the end of the program. This is my company. This is the Opportunity Meetup here. We're also, as I said, we're creating a library on the Invest Local Colorado website under Opportunity Zones. And then I've been putting myself out there as somebody who's willing to tackle opportunity zones and try to figure out, make them apply to particular projects. And right now we're working on tech, we're working on housing, food, transportation, and a lot of the common things that are out there. I've had chats with a number of people about how we can create a new form of financing for lifelong learning, skills training that would be appropriate to things going on today. And so those are the primary things that we're going to look at. So that's tonight's program, and we'll cut the recording here, and I'll take questions at this time.